Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I think we will start now in a few seconds. It's more hot in the front and there are still seats.
Yes.
Your Royal Highness. Oh, no Royal Highness. she unfortunately, she had to go to another arrangement. She was here, yeah. But Your Excellency, that's right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. نحن تراثنا. This is Arabic in my dialect, and it means we are our heritage. And this is the slogan of the Saudi Heritage Preservation Society, who are our hosts here tonight, as you can see. Thank you to the Society for receiving us and from all the kindness from the staff, wherever you are. It's been wonderful. Heritage can be interpreted in many ways. It may be buildings like this beautiful example, so dense with history, which was once the home of and part of King Abdulaziz's palace, and which is a frame for this evening. It can be the stone carvings and artifacts of the museum nearby. But it can also be, and this is what the slogan implies, our everyday lives, the traditions around work, planting and harvesting, around marriage, birth-giving, death, religious rituals, language. An intangible heritage. The slogan, "We are our heritage," is so inviting and including. It's also a call to action. It's our obligation to discuss and analyze, to live and embrace our heritage, otherwise it will perish. In which case, not only our past, but also our present and our future are impoverished. In these days, history is being written concerning women and men's lives here in Saudi Arabia. Men and women have been working so hard for this change which is now taking place, and we are privileged to witness this wonderful change. Before I give the floor to event manager Mrs. Majda Aloni, who will introduce d.Sa'd. Majda is part of the board of the Sasa Society. I would just like to thank our sponsors. Henning Larsen Architects, thank you for your support. In my mind, there runs a symbolic bridge between yesterday's traditional buildings, where a special construction allows the houses to be cool in summer, and actually not that cold in winter. You can feel it. And today's intended sustainability of the financial city. Thank you also to Arla Foods and Anton Berg for their support. And now I give the floor to Majda. Thank you very much.
Dear guests, I'm honored to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor د.سعد al-Bazai. In 1991, al-Bazai published his first book entitled Desert Culture, ثقافة الصحراء. A title obviously related to his presentation tonight. Professor al-Bazai later work, his lecture, paper, and other books all indicate a continuing interest in a subject that he says as quite important and like to share with us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, here's our speaker, Professor د.سعد al-Bazai.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you. Thank you, Marie-Louise. Thank you, Majda. Good evening, everybody. And thank you for coming. This is the first time in my life that I speak while shivering. Yeah, but I think the warmth of the feelings are enough, is enough to keep me put and able to address you. The subject is, I hope, interesting to you. The fact that you are all here indicates that, and I hope that my speech will fulfill your expectations. We are in a Saudi house and in a Scandinavian weather, isn't it? Yes, we are in what is called the mud house. And I'd like to begin with the mud house, where we are. As Marie-Louise mentioned, this used to be a palace, one of King Abdulaziz's palaces. And as a matter of fact, it is one of those palaces, but also it is not. It is not in the sense that it has been renovated in such a way that it has changed in many ways. One of those ways is that we do not feel as warm as a mud house should give us, as mud house should do, should warm us up, because mud is more suitable to the environment. But this is, of course, concrete inside and has been, worked out so that it can survive. My speech actually is to a great extent related to what this house is all about. The transformation of heritage from one stage to the other is a story of survival, of how folklore, how culture manages to continue living, how it adapts to changed circumstances, to different environments, to different people even. And this transformation is neither unique nor new. Most cultures have been through this process of change from one stage to the other. Europe knew this in the medieval ages. Scandinavian cultures themselves moved from orality to literacy in the medieval ages. And other cultures have experienced a similar change. Arabic culture witnessed an earlier change. Around the 8th century, we saw the first stage, or our culture passed through the first stage of what we call writing, the stage of writing, when Arab culture moved from its orality to literacy, when numerous scholars sat down and wrote what was being recited what people knew by heart, and when they wrote that down so that it can be preserved for later generations. Of course, the Holy Quran came first, and then other traditions followed, and that was what we call now the first age of writing. We call it Asr al-Tadween, when Arab culture came down into paper. And well, what happened afterwards, of course, was a long process in which writing weakened as a result of various factors that I'm not going into here, because this is not a lecture about history. But I mentioned that as a background because when Saudi Arabia was formed about 100 years ago, another stage started in our lives, in our culture, a stage in which orality started to disappear gradually, and another stage started in which so many of our traditions came or went through another process of writing. Now, to talk about orality, actually this is not the title of the speech, this is something I'm going to talk about, but to talk about the process of moving from orality to digitality, as I called this speech or this presentation, it tells only part of the story. This process was, of course, basic and very important. But there was another process similar to it, but it cannot be called orality and cannot be described by using this concept of orality and literacy. It's actually more of a movement from spontaneity to artificiality, if I may say so. I mean, it may be an exaggeration to say artificiality, but it is, in a sense, that. And I will try to explain by showing you some examples of what I'm talking about. Now, before we move to the examples, actually to the more interesting part of the speech, I'll have to bore you a little bit with a few ideas about why or how we have arrived at an understanding of what's happening to cultures. How cultures move from one stage to the other, and what affects culture when it moves from a stage like orality or spontaneity to artificiality and writing. Numerous scholars have studied this phenomenon and came up with various results. Of course, anthropologists are very much interested in such a phenomenon, but also critics of culture have also studied it. And one of those who actually influenced me to a great extent when I came across his ideas, and it really fascinated me to see culture from that perspective. He is an American cultural critic named Walter J. Ong. And there he is. Walter J. Ong died a few years ago, and but he actually left very important work on this side of academic studies. He distinguished literacy, or what he called literacy from orality, of course, but also looked at what he called primary and secondary orality. And that's, I think, of great importance to understanding what we are talking about, or what I'm going to talk about tonight. You can see the text in front of you. The notion of secondary orality was introduced by Walter Ong to describe the communitarian effects that electronic media can induce. And in his 1982 book, Orality and Literacy, The Technologizing of the Word, he claims that at the same time with telephone, radio, I'm just, actually this is a quotation taken out of context, but I hope it makes sense. At the same time with telephone, radio, television, and various kinds of sound tape, electronic technology has brought us into the age of secondary orality. Now, this is interesting because Ong says that we have lost orality and moved into literacy. But there is another orality that has continued with us. And it is an artificial orality. That's what he calls secondary orality. And by that, he means the orality of TV, the orality of cinema. The new orality has striking resemblance to the old in its participatory mystique, that people participate in it, like the old orality. It's fostering of a communal sense where people feel together. Its concentration on the present moment and even its use of formulas. Okay, I'll stop reading now and talk about something more specific. Now, when I talk about Saudi heritage, what has happened to it, I'm referring to a stage when people created culture orally or participated and practiced the various arts in a more spontaneous manner. Dances, songs, poetry recitation, all of those activities were more or less spontaneous. People did them or made them or practiced them at home, in their communities together. And this continued for a long time. I mean, in our modern history. Then there came a time when all of this began to change. And the transformation of that heritage was visible to those who are living it and those who came from the outside, the observers, but probably people who were observing it from the outside saw it more clearly. I belong to a generation which lived those folklores spontaneously. But then I felt, among others, of course, that something happened where the heritage itself lost that spontaneity, where secondary orality, what Ong calls secondary orality, came in and occupied the space. This affected all the performing arts, almost all of them. And of course, I'm talking about dance, and songs, and even games, communal games. And I have examples to show you so that you can see what has happened. Of course, most of you have been to Janadriya. And Janadriya is a living example of what I'm talking about. It's all choreographed, staged, highly artificial. It is art, beautiful, nice, but it's not really the spontaneous thing that used to happen, that people used to live and practice. But I will begin not with Janadriya. I'll begin with an example from poetry recitation. And the first example, here we have, this is a channel, a TV channel called the Sahara, the desert. And it will show us a Bedouin who recites poetry in the traditional manner. He himself is not part of the new generation or the new change. This is, his name is Rida Tarif, and he's from the Shammari tribe. Most of you haven't heard of him. The pastor introducing him, he's saying that this is one of the most famous pioneers of poetry recitation. Now this man is not here as a poet. No, I'm not talking about this man, the other man. He's not as a poet, he is here as a memory, someone who knows by heart what other poets have composed. He knows it by heart, and he has a unique way of reciting poetry. Of course, but so he says he's also honored to be here.
with عمرك من أشهر الرواة وأنت المرجعية حتى لنا احنا يا الإعلاميين. أدورك وين ما تكون لين أجدك على البيت وعلى الموروث الشعبي عموما. أبو عبيد روايتك هذه من المصدر لها أول ما بديت.
He's asking him, where did you get those poems? Who was your source for those poems?
من متى بديت؟ والله بديت مبطي من يوم أنا صغير. كم عمرك أول ما بديت تروي القصيد؟ أول ما بديت تروي القصيد.
He asks him, when did you start reciting poetry? He was about 16 years old. He was so young that he was, yeah.
أي إلا أول ما بديت تجمع القصيد كم عمرك؟
When did you start collecting poetry? 19, 20.
أول ما بديت تروي وتخبر قبل مجالس البادية. أي نعم. أجلس عندها رجال ويتبادلون بينهم.
Okay.
هاك الوقت.
Well, he will begin, of course, reciting poems that he knows by heart. Of course, he's a phenomenal person. He makes no mistakes whatsoever. He goes smoothly through poems, long poems, and it's almost a profession. But what strikes me in such an interview is that he is not really well connected to the TV atmosphere. He is not showing, he's not acting. And that's the closest thing to what I call a spontaneous poetry recitation in our heritage, especially in the heritage of the Najd and northern Arabia. And of course, being Shammari means that he comes from the north of Arabia. Now, the next example is exactly the opposite. Muhammad bin Sharhan is another poetry reciter, and he is well known for being a real actor in the way he reads poetry, he recites. He also has a phenomenal memory. He knows almost more poems than the other gentlemen. But the way he does it indicates that he is very well tuned to the new media. And he plays it very well. He's even hired by some people to recite poems. And he doesn't only recite poems, but he makes people laugh. He entertains them. He makes jokes. He recites the poems in a way that he almost acts the poem out. It's like acting it. You feel what's going on in the poem. He will stop in the middle and he says, I can almost visualize the man coming now. And then he is, and then he starts another line. And it's like staging the poem, which is a real movement to the digital age. I mean, I think this is an example of that. Can we? Look. Now, there are people sitting beside him, but he is so conscious of the camera, of the audience.
ما يبعدون عن العز عشان يكشكشون عليه. راعي البيت اللي اسمه سليم. وحدة من العز توسلت لها جلال وتسولف على وحدة تناظر راسه تلبس وتحسي عليها عن رجل انها ميت من 50 سنة تقول اني ما لقيت عقبه رجال سريع. والثانية تحسي على الثانية اللي جنبها عن اخونا.
Of course, those who know him are enjoying the jokes more than the poem, actually. And that's, I mean, something that everybody knows. All those who know him are certain about. So, Muhammad bin Sharhan is another poetry reciter who is tuned to the new media, but there is another stage, a stage that followed Muhammad bin Sharhan and a younger generation of poetry reciters who are actually, or who function in an environment even less related to society, less related to the community. And I'm giving an example from a well-known poet, a younger poet, Nasser Farana, who became famous just a few years ago. Now, لا نرجع عليه.
الثانية طبعا الحقيقة أن الشعر.
Look at the background.
موهبة من الله سبحانه وتعالى.
This is a studio, basically. It's not even a traditional setting. We are in a studio. And the flowers, and the microphone, everything is staged. That's what I call digital.
والحقيقة يعني من محاصن الصدف انها الرجل ذا الحقيقة اللي جمالة على عامة.
Okay. All right. So that's on the side of poetry recitation. If we go to a familiar form of dancing and singing, actually a combination of both, Samri, the familiar form, those who have been to Janadriya should have seen that type of dancing. Samri has also gone through a similar transformation. It is basically a very, very popular form of entertainment in this part of actually in the eastern province, in the middle of Arabia, as well as in the north. You may not find it in Hijaz or in the south, but it is very popular in these parts of Arabia. Now, Samri begins. The first example is what I call spontaneous Samri. This is Dosari Samri. This is almost a wedding, actually, basically a wedding, but nobody is paying attention to the camera. And that's the point I'm trying to make. People are not really looking at the camera. They are not conscious of the camera. They are doing it spontaneously. Completely oblivious of an audience. And the sound. It was spontaneous sound. I mean, this is natural. This is something that I am familiar with. As a young man, I used to take part in similar dances, not exactly this one, but actually when weddings were held, people would, neighbors usually, would get together, sometimes in the street. They have their carpets and then all the drums and etc. And they begin singing and dancing without being conscious of someone watching them or to please someone. What has happened is that spontaneity has almost been lost. And what has now replaced it is this form. This is from Janatria. Look at the dress. I mean, everybody's dressed the same. They are almost like a team of dancers. These come from Al-Jawf, from the north part of Saudi Arabia. The photography is not professional, actually. It's almost... well organized, highly conscious of the audience. They are moving according to certain rules. They know where to stop, which is actually the opposite of what was happening with the other group, the former group, who were unaware almost of anything being done to record their activity. The third example is more funny, but actually that's the digital part of it. I mean, I'll leave you with the King Sam. This is like the first one, basically like the first one, but this is really we could go on and on actually, and I could spend actually half an hour at least analyzing this. It is interesting and it's full of messages. Anyone who has studied the media, this is full of information, of messages, of changes, political messages. There are political messages here. In addition to the ironic replication of the traditional dance. These people are making a statement or statements about the culture. But that's not, and we don't want to go into that at the moment. But however, this is a very stark example of the transformation I'm talking about. It's Samri, but it's really something else at the same time. Now the third stage and the last one, the last group of examples concern Al-Arda. And Al-Arda has also gone through similar change, and we'll probably talk about the recent developments in this context now. Now Al-Arda, there are different types of Arda in the Arabian Peninsula. The Najdi Arda, of course, is probably the most famous, But there are, of course, ardas in Janub, in the south, and in the north, in the east. Almost all parts of Arabia have their forms of arda. The arda is basically a war dance. It's a dance that people perform before going into battle. It is to warm the fighters up. And actually, that's why even the words of the arda are usually words about fighting. There is no love in those poems, for example. Unlike Samri, which is an art to be performed at night when people are relaxing, late at night actually even, and at weddings. Even al-arda can be performed at weddings, but al-arda has this warlike atmosphere of people even well armed for the fight. Now, we will see first an example of arda from Janub, from the south. This is a different form of, but this is more spontaneous. I mean, this is more or less choreographed. I mean, performed in an atmosphere where the dancers almost imitate the original. They are not in a war situation, of course, but even the dress indicates that they have prepared for it very well. There is a high degree of artificiality in it. It's not the people themselves. This is a team of dancers who have been brought to perform. But they are performing in a street, after all. I mean, it's not on a stage. There isn't much interest or focus on taking pictures, on anybody videotaping it, and they are not even looking at a camera. So there is that situation which is semi-artificial, I might call it. The next example of Najdi Arda from this part of Arabia, of Saudi Arabia, which is really more spontaneous. This is from Janadriya in 1992. Well, the spontaneities, I think, is clear in the way they are dressed, at least. The way they are photographed. There is that element of not being really well done or staged, or there is no consciousness of people watching them. So this was Janadriya at an early stage of its development. Now you won't see anything like that. Now everything is designed, well prepared. People come to the dances knowing that they are performing for others, not for themselves. And that's the crucial difference. The third example will tell you what has changed. Now this is, before you begin, this is when King Abdullah went to Bahrain. There was the Arda was, of course, is a shared dance, I mean, the whole Gulf. So Bahrain have a similar dance. very close to the one we have here. And the Bahrainis staged this in front of the two kings, King of Saudi Arabia and the King of Bahrain. But there was something interesting in this particular example. Now this is how usually Arda begins, someone saying the poem. And this is an imitation of the original. So they are preparing now for the dance. But of course he's reading from, he doesn't know it by heart. That's important. He doesn't know it by heart. And that's... This is a well-known singer named Rashid al-Majid. He is acting like the traditional announcer of the Arab. But look at the way it's done. And it has nothing almost to do with the one in 1992. Look at the dress. The Bahrainis are dressed like their flag, which is red. His dress is similar to the traditional dress of Arab, which is الموروث, we call it الموروث. It has long... Now, what's different about this is that we have a singer. I mean, the Arda doesn't have a singer. Now, this is something really that I don't know whether this example has been repeated. It is, I think, unique, but maybe the situation itself called for something like this, to bring a famous singer to sing out the words instead of the two sides, which is what happens usually in Arda, two sides, saying the lines, and there is usually a poet telling each line of dancers what to say next. That's what happens in the traditional dance. Here we have a famous singer who usually sings in studios, brought in to lead the singing, and then the lines of dancers repeat after him. I don't know what exactly required that, but it was something unique, and I think it also gives a very clear example of the transformation I'm talking about. It is not probably a digitalization, but it is an artificialization. Highly, and the Arda has almost forgotten its real, its authentic nature, and has become something that could be watched on a stage, on theater, instead of being a popular form. There are no people in this type, nor in Janadriya, by the way. I mean, even in Janadriya, the audience cannot perform, cannot get in, like in what used to be in traditional Arda. And in weddings, anybody could join the dancers. I mean, anybody can ask to and just take part in it. With these people, you can only watch. You are an audience. You are not part of the thing. I'm not sure whether this has carried the messages I've been trying to convey to you, but I hope you have seen at least aspects of the change that has affected this part of heritage, of Saudi heritage, not actually Gulf heritage as well, has passed through the same process of change. Whether this is something to be welcomed or not, I don't know, but some of us, at least people like me, really feel sad sometimes when when this is distanced from them. Ong call it secondary orality. I think it is a secondary orality. It is something staged. Secondary orality for Ong is something like we see it in what we call in TV, basically. In for example, those programs on TV where there is an audience and there are prizes to be offered. What they do there is really staging. Everything is staged. It looks like the real thing. It's not the real thing. I remember going to TV at the beginning of when TV was introduced here in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia. I was in the first year of college. And I went to the TV station. It was easy. I mean, from the street you can go into the station. I mean, nobody objected, no guards, nothing. And then I sat down with the audience, and there was Muhammad Abdu, the most famous probably singer. And then I discovered that there were lamps that told people when to clap, when to stop. Later on, when I read Walter Ong and what he says about secondary orality, I understood what that meant, why that was happening. It was an imitation of the real thing, of the original thing. It wasn't the real thing. Well, this is not the real thing. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Very interesting and amusing. And now the floor is open for questions, and we have microphones that will go around. Yes? I think it's coming. It's on its way.
Thank you very much, first of all, for Sasa for inviting me. I feel honored to be here. I also would like to thank, my name is Abdulaziz Al-Nahid. I am a retired psychiatrist and I am useless at the moment. I would like to thank D.Sa'd for this great lecture, and I have, to be honest, I think there is something going on with this. Why is it making so much noise? Okay, are we better now? Yes. And yes, I'm grateful to D.Sa'd here very much, because he has actually somehow put into words what I have been feeling all my life. I have to confess that I am over 60 years old, and I feel that at the back of my head or the back of my life there is a big hole, a black hole, that actually sucks a lot of pleasure and brings me a lot of sadness. Because I look around me and I see nothing of my heritage. In fact, I do say that I really don't remember anything of my heritage, because I grew up on first cars and then TVs and things like that. And there was some sort of transformation in the beginning, and the transformation was so quick and so potent that I actually really now do not remember anything of my heritage. And I look around me and I look to our poetry and I look to our dance, and I feel that politics and religion and the anthropological change that has happened to the middle of this kind of peninsula has actually affected that. Now, if I go into, for instance, let's say our art now is dance, and the dance is just the war dance, the artha. And then when you look at it, it is full of symbolism of violence, of war and anger and wanting to attack people. And then if you try to look at it from the other side, and then you see that there is the other part of the poetry is talk about women and how beautiful that they are, etc., etc. And that has a sexual connotation that I'm never happy about. And then when you go again, the third subject that I think most often hear in the poems is talking about camels. By the way, I personally think that the camel is an ugly animal, but that's a personal opinion. How beautiful is the camels, etc., 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 or my goats, or my cows, or whatever. Now, I look around me and I want to find, you know, I was lucky to be introduced to English and to English poetry from the beginning. And I find that there is actually, I'm sorry, I forgot to say that there is one more thing. Talk about how big, how good our men are, how generous we are, how welcoming to our guests we are, how we, you know, kill everything for them, all our animals, even the one that brings milk to our children. And that's, in my idea, is something that I find a little abhorrent. And then I would go to Janadria or come here and sit and look at this beautiful. This is almost choreographed. It doesn't look like what I saw when I was young. It is absolutely different. Like D.Sa'd exactly put everything in perspective for me. I think that he has opened my eyes or put into words what I have been feeling all my life. That there is, you know, everything is choreographed, everything is touched, everything is beautiful. But it's not me, it is not us. Now look at the door in front of you here. This is a beautiful door, fine. And it is new and it is all made up and doors never looked like this before. I can tell you. All the doors that we had, we actually took them and we used them to get a bit warm and burn them. Now, this is one issue that, you know, bothers me, makes me sad. And I am actually appealing if D.Sa'd could tell me, how could I actually take out this sadness? How do I feel that I have heritage? I do not have any heritage at the moment, and that bothers me a lot. And then the political transformation, things that are happening at me, around us, things to do with politics, with religion, with women, with men, with, you know, our relationship with the outside world also is something that bothers me. Anyway, I know that I am very boring and I would like to apologize, but I have expressed one of the issues that I feel that are very important for me. There is another issue that I would like to talk to.
Next time.
Very interesting.
Yeah, very good.
First of all, thank you, Doctor, for your presentation. I have a different view. I'm not your generation, obviously. I'm 27 years old, and I'm lucky to live at the moment where TV was haram, to be honest. So I had to see those stuff in reality, where there's no staging or there is no artificiality or anything of that. But I have my 5 years younger brother. He's 5 years old. He was born next to an iPad. Don't you think those staging or artificiality thing is good for him to remind him that there is an heritage? Like, he didn't live in those moments. He grew up in different era. I mean, you know, Saudi Arabia 10 years ago, it wasn't even close to what we are now. It's a huge different mentality and culture. I lived at the moment. I remember that situation. I went to my mother and told her, we considered in our society as so open-minded family. I told my mother I want an iPhone. You remember, not iPhone, it was the Banda with the camera. She said, no, it's haram. It was 10 years ago. Imagine how transformation happened now. So the idea, it's just an opinion, and if we can discuss about that the staging, what we have seen here in Janadria, or those stuff, or artificiality, or anything, I think it's kind of a positive thing to remind the new generation who know nothing about this stuff, who had never saw those stuff in reality. Just remind them who are they, what they belong to, how their grandparents used to live in. My father, he's 45 years old, and I'm not joking, he literally lived in a tent. Now he's using a car. Imagine, him 40 years old, like how big transformation that's happened. So for me, I think staging and artificiality at URC is a positive thing for the new generation. That's it. Thank you so much.
Would you like me to comment on this? Actually, what you have said and what the doctor has said raises an important question, which is this is inevitable. seems to be inevitable. This has to happen. So is there a way to preserve the authenticity of what we used to see? The fact that this has been transformed seems to serve a purpose, which is letting the next generation know what happened before. But we have different types of preservation. Of course, this place is a result of one process or one approach to preserve culture, to preserve heritage, which is renovating it. Now, if you look at YouTube, YouTube has preserved a great deal of ancient cultures, of disappearing cultures, but has preserved them sometimes in their authentic form, like the 1992 Arda, I showed you, for example. You can see both, actually. You can see the artificial and the authentic or semi-authentic form. But still, I mean, the question is there. I mean, the movement is towards more and more staging and artificiality, and people are increasingly distanced from arts that they use to perform themselves, instead of being watching them performed for them as audience. But I mean, I see your point. It's really a valid point. Thank you.
Please. I think we have a lady down there, and then I will come to you.
Thank you, Doctor, for your wonderful presentation. It's really interesting. But one opinion I have, the fact that, you know, you said there's spontaneity against artificial and all those things, is that nonetheless, I feel like it's still both ways. It's a very good thing. Of course, it's always better if it's real and preserved in that way. But I guess even the artificialness will actually give you like a good look back at, you know, okay, this is how Saudi heritage was like, and maybe, you know, encourage people to try to reflect back and go back to it. Do you really feel that the reason why there's a decline in authenticity and more people going more towards the showmanship and all, because there's this hunger or this thirst for authenticity, and that hunger or thirst is not being quenched by the real folklore, the real artists, the real poets, that there's not much of them left around, that maybe something has to be done to somehow uplift that part of the heritage, that maybe the poets, they're too poor to keep doing this because there's no money in that. Maybe it's better for them to go find better jobs or do something like that where they can feed their, you know, children and everything in a better way. Because I know that if you come from a poet family or you know, you're a poet in that tribe, you remain a poet for generations, and that's what you keep doing, because children will learn from their father the poems and they inherit that. So do you think it's that maybe the decline is coming because these poets or the folklore is disappearing generation after generation, and people are moving towards more modernity and to try to satisfy their economic status or their, you know, family status like that? Thank you.
Okay, I want to get you right. I mean, you're raising the possibility of the economy being a part of it, a reason?
Not just the economy, maybe like the fact that, you know, maybe they just don't find it a good thing to do anymore. Like, you know, there's not many, for example, even if they're losing their audience, for example, nobody's really there to listen, or something like any other reasons, maybe economic, could be any of those factors. Is it that the reason? Because if there must be a decline, that's why people love to, like, you know, this sir over here, he actually said that, you know, he's really losing his heritage. So it's not like people, maybe it's that, and TV is so easy to access, just turn on and you see, you know, there it is. So maybe people are not going to those poets anymore, maybe they're not going to those events, or, you know, something like that. Do you think that's the reason why the decline in authenticity, and then you have all this showmanship and people coming on TV with the fantastic graphics and everything. And yeah.
Well, as I said before, I think this seems to be almost inevitable. I mean, this change has to take place. But the question is there a way that we can interfere in this? Is there something that we can do to at least preserve some authenticity to this, so that it doesn't become completely digital? I think every age has its own arts, has to develop its own arts. And I don't want really to make my presentation a performance in nostalgia, or an exercise in nostalgia. Simply saying, oh, we have lost this. And, yes, we have lost something, but we are probably gaining something else. So we have to be also able to see what's happening now that has real value, instead of simply looking at the past and bewailing the loss and and expressing sadness that we have lost it. Yeah, I think you are making your remarks are to the point, to a great extent. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, first and foremost. I actually have two questions. One is regarding the Arda performance, the dance before war. Yes. To begin with, wasn't that, you said it was different in the north, the south, and wherever you came from. Isn't it then in some way choreographed to begin with? I understand it's the interaction with the crowd that is different now, but maybe it's not that different if you keep on holding on to something like that. One of my other comments is actually trying to preserve the heritage. It could also be architecturally. I went to Jeddah not so long ago, and it's a beautiful city, but it's falling apart, and you almost feel like there is no preserving in the beauty of that city, and that's an old city as well that was there for I don't know how long, but that could be something one could do to hold on to what you have.
Yeah. Yeah, and with regard to architecture, of course, this is also similar to what happened in Jeddah. The preservation of the midtown, that's what we are referring to. I'm really happy about the preservation of that part of Jeddah, and it has happened actually in certain parts of this region as well. Some smaller villages have been preserved. Quote unquote, preservation here means really creating museums, basically. Museums where people can watch the past, but not live it. It's almost impossible, not almost, it is impossible to go back and live the same thing, and do the same thing again. With regard to the Arda, in the past, there was, of course, choreography. It is choreography. Arda is a dance, after all. But when I say choreographed, I mean it has been artificialized. Choreographed in the sense of being staged, of being transformed into a theater, where the people who used to participate are not allowed to do so, and are forced to sit in the audience, among the audience, and watch something that their fathers or grandfathers used to do themselves. So it has become almost, actually, Janadriya is a museum, basically. A museum of arts, of performing arts. Now, Saudis go to Janadriya not to dance, but to watch the dances that used to be part of daily life, part of their festivities. So Janadriya is a living museum in a sense. I mean, it's lively. It's like the museum, the National Museum here. So yes, the Arda has gone through a similar transformation, but the choreography is now artificial. It's not as it used to be. I used to dance Arda. I love it actually, but there is no way now I can dance it. I personally, I'm speaking to you from a personal perspective. Well, there happens those rare moments when you see it here and there, staged, and we are allowed to get into the performance, but that happens only on rare occasions. Thank you. Dr. Fawziya, please.
My name is Fawziya Al-Bakr, and I am a member of the SASA group, board along with Louise and others. Thank you, Doctor. I'm not gonna be long because I'm really cold. And there's a lot of food, guys, waiting for you. I mean, lots of Saudi food and sweets and everything.
That's the question.
Yes. Thank you so much for this because I'm just always thinking about it, but I've never put my hand into it. So you gave me a life examples of the things, but from the way I see it, I think there is the more effective two probably factors. One is modernity, because we thought being modern you just have to raise all the old tradition and old ways of living and live in these cement villas and etc. So that's where, and I don't think there was a strategy to the future. So I could see where when you talk about Jeddah falling down, of course, and it's everywhere, unfortunately. The other thing, I think it's because of what happened with the with the Sahwa thing, religious, when they came after the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, and all the cultural elements of the society was, abolished, and so that's why the new generation, they don't know, and we didn't know, and now apparently people are, starting to wake up, and I think what you're doing now is part of the solution. Thank you.
Wow, you're introducing something that I never thought about. Has the religious revival, Sahwa, been a factor in distancing people from arts that used to be part of their daily life? Of course, I know that there are people those who are fundamentalists, who would say that this is wrong and people should not dance and sing, etc., etc. This may have been a factor, but I wouldn't rush into saying this is the factor. I think it may have played a part in it. Yes, why not? It is a phenomenon that hasn't been studied, I think. It is yet to be looked into more closely, what's going on now.
Really?
Yeah, I don't know anybody who studied it.
Look, for an outsider, it's obvious that, of course, it will play a big role.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm Jumana Johani, a 21st-year-old. As you said, Doctor, artificiality, I guess, is inevitable. And I think our generation is the one who should be worrying, because the only heritage I can see is through pieces of my grandmother, you can say, or my mother, through stories that she tells. And I don't at all see it within our generation. I think modernity took over the whole thing. So whenever we lose them, you say, I can say that the past generation, or my grandmother, for instance, I think this is the time where we definitely will lose the heritage as a whole, because there won't be, a people, or there won't be those who would remind us that, okay, there is a heritage that you should be reminded of. And for example, I'm from the Western region specifically, so also Jeddah and Medina, and it has lots of various heritage. Unlike, for example, Arba is from the middle region. So yeah, so I think our generation, the young generation, is the one who should be very worried.
Yes, you're right.
Thank you.
Why do you think they should?
Because yes, modernity, as I said, it's
losing something.
exactly it's cyber. For example, we're more exposed to them, to the cyberity generally. So there's
Nothing has replaced that, you think? I mean, for your generation, I mean,
Yeah.
you don't have your own arts.
Yeah. This is what I think. It's more of it has become international. So generally, globalization.
Yeah.
Exactly. This is the word, globalization. So I don't think there will be something unique.
Yeah.
You can say. So, yeah.
Quite interesting. Thank you.
Can I comment?
Yes.
Funny enough. Yes, absolutely.
Yes. No, this is just a small remark, and I'm not Saudi, so I don't know anything about this. And I just know that in our part of the world, we have, of course, a heritage that is now in museums, like you said. We can go there and harvest the way they did in the old days. But in the meantime, our lives create all the time new heritage. I mean, it's the way we live here and today, and this is going to be the heritage. And when I have been to, I mean, it's easy for me to see in my own country what I like and what I don't like, but there are a lot of things that are authentic. If they are authentic for the people who do them, they are authentic. And here, when I have been invited to, for example, a wedding, and there you saw people dancing, and that was spontaneous, and everybody could do what they wanted to do. In Ramadan, you see people streaming out into the streets and visiting neighbors, and I can't say what that means to you, but to me, it means heritage, and this happens today. So I think the point is just maybe to see it where it is, and then do that. And traditions change when persons pass away, when you have a new child, new traditions, but if they're authentic to the people who perform them, isn't that fine?
Yeah.
Can I just add something over here? I'm sorry. My name is Amir. I work with Henning Larsen Architects, and a lot of the discussion today has been about architecture as well. And as Marie-Louise was pointing out, I mean, there's something good in everything, and I think a couple of people are pointing that out as well. And there's nothing to be upset about. When you finished your speech, you said you were upset about losing the heritage. But I think what's more important is actually understanding that the heritage is still there. It just needs to be preserved in a proper way. And then things that are to come, like for instance the King Abdullah Financial District, what we do there is actually we try to understand how the sun works in relation to the building, similar to old mud sort of villages in Saudi Arabia. They all have ideal conditions of shade, of sun, to give maximum protection at all times of day. The materials were, architects or the builders back then understood the materials, understood the right way of using them as well. So I think it's actually going back and looking at that and how that can be optimized. Yes, and there are so many great spots in Saudi Arabia. You have a lot of heritage. It's just as if nobody has known what to do with it, either for political reasons or for whatever reasons might have been. So when you see Jeddah, one of the hearts of Saudi Arabia, and has been for generations, it's where the pilgrims came through, when you go to Mecca and Medina and so on, but it's actually falling apart, and it's really a shame. And you have a ton of hotspots like that in Saudi Arabia where you can go as a tourist and visit, and it's just standing there waiting. It's a heritage that's unused actually. And heritage for me is also about architecture, and that's what a lot of people see as a heritage. But it's absolutely right, it's also about literature and dance and everything else, and how people interact. but it's also about the inclusiveness. So what can Saudis do to include each other more, the older generation? What can they do to include their youngs? I mean, most young people will appreciate that. I appreciate that, and I'm sure many other people do. But to go back, I mean, when it comes to the architecture, the way it's approached from our side is that we try to look at what was the old way. You know, look back, use the optimum from it. You know, and then look forward and use it. Yes, thank you.
Quite interesting. Yeah, I think I agree with Marie-Louise that the heritage is continually being created. The question is what kind of heritage is being created. Also, what kind of relationship do we have to the heritage that's not being used, as you said. The only problem that I find is that the new generation seems to have lost the way to deal with the ancient heritage and to develop something that is really authentic and tuned to the environment also. I mean, we have, we are exposed, like every nation in the world, to various influences, various factors coming to us through TV, through the internet, through other channels, and these intervene or participate in creating something else that's being developed. Maybe we are not watching it. We don't know what it is exactly, but I would like that thing which is developing, whether in architecture or in other arts, to be more relevant, more tuned to the environment. For example, I mean, in architecture, we've been over the last 50 years or so, we have been building houses that have nothing to do with the environment. I mean, that kind of thing. And perhaps this is happening also in other aspects of our lives. Adopting habits, doing things that are either harmful to the environment and to ourselves, or simply out of tune. I mean, and meaningless, like adopting a sort of a habit that is more fitting to the Chinese or to the Argentinians or to someone else, rather than to this part of the world. I'm not against, of course, opening up to other cultures and interacting with that, but it's also important to be part of your environment. To some extent, this is authenticity. This is what I call authenticity, whether it's in architecture or in the performing arts or in other aspects. How long do we have to go?